This is Beyond the Big Screen podcast with your host, Steve Guerra.
Thank you for listening to Beyond the Big Screen. Of course, a big thanks goes out to Robert Gaudi, author of The War of Jenkins' Ear, The Forgotten Struggle for North and South America, 1739 to 1742. Links to learn more about Robert Gaudi and his book can be found in the show notes. A great way to support Beyond the Big Screen is to leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. These ratings and reviews really help me know what you're thinking of the show and help other people learn about Beyond the Big Screen. You can learn more about Beyond the Big Screen, great movies and stories so great that they should be movies, on Facebook and Twitter by searching for A2Z History. You can contact me there or just send me an email to my email address, steve@a2zhistorypage.com. Links to all of this and more can be found at beyondthebigscreen.com. I am very excited to talk to our special guest today, Robert Gaudi, author of The War of Jenkins' Ear, The Forgotten Struggle for North and South America, 1739 to 1742. Robert Gaudi is a writer, historian, and journalist. He has been featured in the Washington Post, Washington Examiner, Harper's, and many other publications. He attended Iowa's Writers' Workshop, which probably helps explain why this book was so wonderfully written and just a real pleasure to read. Thank you, Robert, so much for coming on the show today.
Thank you. Great to be here.
I have to say that I savored this book as I was reading it. It's just so it completely draws you into this story, and I think it takes narrative nonfiction to the next level. So I'm really excited to talk about this book and The War of Jenkins' Ear. Now, you have a really unusual story on how you got interested in this book, and I take it, like most of us, you didn't have a lifelong fascination with The War of Jenkins' Ear. How did you stumble onto this really fascinating story, but not very well-known story?
I mean, it's a name that you hear. You've heard of this, ridiculous wars. How about the War of Jenkins' Ear? So that's the first thing. So I always had kind of a vague, sort of in the back of my head, what the heck was all that about? But then, a few years ago, I was at the flea market in Georgetown. I'm here in D.C. And I found a dealer who sold like silver and, rings and stuff. He had some medals, and one of them was this odd-looking coin that turned out to be a commemorative medal impressed during the War of Jenkins' Ear. So I picked it up. I said, "What's this?" He said, "Oh, it's a commemorative piece. It's British. It's a couple hundred years old." I took some pictures of it, and I found out that in fact there are thousands of them. I mean, it was an early collectible that a company during this war, a company in England made a medallion of one of the commanders, Admiral Vernon. So that's how I kind of got into this book.
Now, how does this war in the really broad context fit into early colonial American history?
Well, I guess I should explain a little bit about the war and where it came from and all that. So it was a real war. I mean, tens of thousands of people died. We don't hear about it here because the British lost. Essentially, they lost to Spain, which was the Spanish Empire was in its dying, hours. And in Spain, they know it better. In fact, raised a statue to the one man who sort of staved off the British, Blas de Lezo, who was an admiral, a Basque admiral, raised the statue in Madrid just a few years ago, like in the 2010s, and they call it like La Guerra del Asiento, the War of the Contract. So, briefly, do you have 3 hours? Briefly, this war springs out of the devastating War of Spanish Succession, which was really one of the first, if not the first major world war in history. So, in the War of Spanish Succession, which happened between 1700 and 1715, Carlos II of Spain, who was the last of the Spanish Hapsburgs, died. And he was incredibly deformed. The Hapsburgs interbred like, two rabbits in a hutch. I don't know. And, his aunt was also his sister, like this kind of thing. He had, this incredible jaw that he couldn't close. He drooled constantly. His lower half of his body was spindly. He was certainly impaired, mentally in certain ways. In any case, he had no offspring. So at the end of his life, he had to bequeath Spain and its vast empire, which then included parts of Europe, the Netherlands, that was the Spanish Netherlands up there, Belgium, all that. So he had to bequeath it to one of two successors. His nephew, one was his great nephew, I believe, his nephew, who was the son of Louis, or the nephew of Louis XIV of France. So it was either a French candidate, or an Austrian candidate, because of the Austrian Hapsburgs. So he gave it to the French candidate, and this set off a massive war, because the rest of Europe figured that if Spain and France are united, it's just going to be this juggernaut that's going to take over the world. So part of Spain's foreign policy at the time was that the slave trade was regulated in something called the Asiento de Negros, the contract of the blacks. And so they didn't like to trade slaves to their own colonies, so they farmed it out to others. And now the French candidate eventually won the throne, although part of the settlement was that France and Spain were separated. So Britain actually was on the losing side, but did quite well, because Marlborough, who was Churchill's great-great-great-grandfather, was, one of the great soldiers of that war and won many victories. Blenheim, Malplaquet, all these victories. And so as part of their reward, they were awarded the Asiento, the contract to trade slaves to the Spanish colonies in the New World. So the stage is now set for our war of Jenkins' Ear.
Do you think that that's maybe part of the reason why this war doesn't get as much publicity, you might say, is because it's really over a really gross topic of the Spanish want slaves, but they don't really want to get their hands dirty on it. And then you have all these other countries that are trying to scoop up the slave trading contract. It's not it's a very realistic part of history, and especially that time period, but it's not a very, it's not what we might put up on our pedestal as our finest hour in history.
I mean, it's also full of weird ironies that don't fit into any, sort of modern box. So as it turns out, the Asiento was not lucrative. So, you couldn't really make money at the slave trade. Now, this is one of the great ironies of history. The British find that what is really wanted in the Spanish colonies are British manufactured goods. And, Britain they started the Industrial Revolution. They had factories at that point, proto factories. They had linens, they irons, all kinds of stuff that they made in England, And so the British found out they could smuggle manufactured goods in slave ships to the Spanish colonies and thus make the money that they thought they were going to make in the slave trade. So it's bizarre. I mean, that it was actually smuggling of manufactured goods and not the slave trade that's sort of started this war, and that was the most lucrative, occupation, vis-a-vis trade at that time. So what happened is the British were flooding the Spanish market with illegal manufactured goods, smuggled in. They had these slave ships. They had a few slaves just for, decorative purposes, if you will. And in between the decks, they had these secret decks that were jammed with trade goods. They had ships that were, supposedly slave ships that weren't, and they just painted the sailors in blackface. So what happened is the Spanish finally got sick of this, and they commissioned a fleet, the Guarda Costa, empowered by treaty to stop any British ship in the Caribbean or near a Spanish colony to search that ship for contraband. So what happened was the Guarda Costa soon began abusing their privileges and became something akin to pirates. So they would stop British merchantmen, ransack the ships. If they didn't find any contraband, they would, torture people. Where's the contraband? We know it's hidden here, And Jenkins was one of these unfortunate British merchants who, in the process of torturing him to find out where his, contraband was, he didn't actually have any. They cut off his ear. And so hence the name of the war.
It's fascinating that this war, because you bring up the War of Spanish Succession, in which had been led to from the wars of the Reformation in the 30 Years War, and then it kind of skips in your history book to the French and Indian War. But this war is really critical to really understanding the French and Indian War. It almost seems like, oh, well, those are the Spanish Succession, that's old, and the French and Indian War, that's leading us to what's like real history. But this war is really kind of the linchpin that holds that whole thing together. Those two pieces of history that seem very different, but it's really kind of one smooth thing.
Well, I forget which historian said, history is one damn thing after another. Yeah, I mean, this war was critical to the development of the colonies and the future United States. And I mean, part of it was that Spain had claim to all of the eastern seaboard up to and including South Carolina at one point. They actually had a province there called Guale in the 17th, in the 16th and 17th centuries. They had Jesuit missions. They had, all kinds of as their empire sort of crumbled from within with all these, deformed kings and such, their borders receded to Florida, to the St. Johns River. But they couldn't, they still laid claim to what became Georgia. So it was called the debatable land. It was this fallow, place where Indians ruled and Spain claimed it. The British wanted it. So a guy named Oglethorpe moved in and established the colony of Georgia in 1733, and the Spanish were outraged. So part of the War of Jenkins' Ear is the defense of Georgia, and Spain almost took Georgia back. So that would have been a huge, detour in American history had they succeeded in doing that.
What was the Spanish's problem with these manufactured goods? Because they weren't really making manufactured goods. That was really a British thing.
Yeah.
What was wrong with them trading why not have a formalized trade system for these goods that clearly people wanted?
I mean, that's what the British said. And there were innumerable negotiations. I mean, believe me, the difficult part of writing this book was making trade interesting. It's just not interesting. But it encompasses a huge piece of our life. So Spain and other colonies in those days, the guiding system was the mercantile system, in which you only traded with the mother country. And that's just the way they did it. They couldn't imagine any other, because it would be like another country profiting off of our colonies kind of thing. So yeah, that was a problem. And the British tried to get, certain trade dispensations. They actually managed to get one ship a year. And so they were allowed to trade 500 tons of goods, which was nothing. It was one ship. And even that, they cheated the heck. The British were great at cheating. So they would send one ship with the 500 tons of trade goods to the various trade fairs. There was one in Portobello, which is now in Panama, Cartagena, which is in Colombia. And they, in the distance, were a bunch of other little ships following with all kinds of other trade goods. And so the one ship that was allowed to trade kept getting refilled at night. It's a miracle, So they did this kind of stuff. But back to your other point regarding why this war is important. So in this war lies the roots of the American Revolution. When the war started, so the war started because Spain kept ransacking English ships. It got worse and worse. The British smuggling got worse and worse, and it just came to a head. And Jenkins had his ear cut off in 1731. 8 years later, in 1739, when the war started, he was made the poster boy of the wounded and degraded British sailor attacked by cowardly Spaniards. So that's how the war. So he was, because there's something very visual about a severed ear, and he kept it in a jar and waved it around. So that's what he did, or a box, or not sure. But in any case, so the British at that time hadn't had a major war since the War of Spanish Succession. They were unprepared. And they didn't have enough troops. They had just had a terrible winter. They had epidemic of typhoid. Thousands that died in England. The crops failed. So they didn't have enough men. They turned for the first time to the colonies, to the American colonies, and they raised 4,000 men. the Gooch's American Legion, and Gooch was a governor of Virginia. And these weren't, I mean, American troops had fought with the British Army as militia, as irregulars, as scouts, but these were regular British Army units, raised what they called on the establishment. They got paid from London. They had supposedly uniforms, British weapons. Well, as it turns out, the Americans, so the war, the crucible of the war for the British was in the Caribbean. And so the British figured if we take the main Spanish trading posts in the Caribbean, we could perhaps take over all of South America. And that was their unstated goal, to seize South America from Spain. And so the first target was Cartagena, which was this very, well-fortified city. So the British recruited 4,000 Americans, get them to Jamaica to begin training them, and just hated them. They had no respect for them. They treated them terribly. They didn't give them food. They didn't give them uniforms. They thought they were, little better than slaves, all this kind of stuff. There's a lot of Catholics, Irish Catholics, gasp. It was a really very integrated army. There were American Indians in that army. There were freed black slaves in that army, in the American regiments. And so the British were aghast and again, treated them terribly. And the Americans never forgot that treatment. So basically the lesson the Americans learned out of that war, and let us not forget, Lawrence Washington, George Washington's older brother, was a captain of one of the American, companies in that war from Virginia. So the lesson learned is don't trust the British. They're not going to treat you well. And very importantly, for the future history of the United States, although I wish we had listened to this more in our history, avoid foreign entanglements. Now, you'll remember that George Washington said that in his farewell address. America should be this inviolate place. You don't get involved in foreign conflicts, that really have no place in. So this was essentially a foreign war. I mean, it was fought mostly in Venezuela and in Colombia and down in the Caribbean. And so the Americans, 90% casualty rate, as they were treated so poorly. No food, no medicine, nothing.
And now, a brief word from our sponsors. I mean, that's pretty amazing. And you can see how that would be so fresh in people's mind, because this is only 30 years, a generation or less before the real boiling over in the late 1760s, 1770s.
Yeah, it's clearly, George Washington, who, he loved his brother, Lawrence. Lawrence was his father. Lawrence was his half brother. Their father, Gus Augustine Washington, died when George was, I think, 10 or 9 or something. And Lawrence was 15 years older than George and became his father figure. The only time George Washington went out of the continental United States, he accompanied his brother to Barbados when his brother was dying of tuberculosis, which he contracted during the War of Jenkins' Ear. So the disease that killed his brother, he caught during the War of Jenkins' Ear in the Caribbean.
It's pretty fascinating that Spain at this time, it looked on paper that it was a strong force, but you're saying that it's a crumbling empire, that it really was on the out and outs by that point. But what was keeping Spain afloat at that point?
I mean, Spain itself as a nation was being kept afloat by the silver and gold wrested out of the mines in the Americas. And so that's the one thing that kept their empire together, was all the silver and gold and pearls and other stuff that they tore out of the backs of the Indians and, et cetera, in the New World. I mean, their heyday was really the era of the conquistadors and, the 16th century, when all their colonies were founded. Now, a series of really demented kings, drove them into the ground. And because, it's been said, I think I said this in the book, that in fact, all that free money, the gold and silver from the Americas, was like heroin to their economic system. Like, it didn't inspire them to do any, to make stuff, to try to found an economy that would include, everyone. And it just was like, more free money's coming. Why should we build factories? It was that kind of thing.
Yeah, it always reminded me, the Spanish Empire, of maybe the startup that got into something really lucrative early, and then they're just cashing it out, and they're never really innovating at all. But they always have that. They're sitting on literally a gold mine.
Yeah, I mean, and there's this sort of attitude they had that, aristocrats or people of good birth didn't seek to make money. It was just, what Protestants did, But yeah, so now Spain won this war. It was a shock to everybody, and they won the war because of one guy, Blas de Lezo, who they call El Medio Hombre, the half man. He was a Basque admiral. He had lost his hand, his arm, his leg, his eye, so he had half his body parts in various Spanish wars since the War of Spanish Succession. And so the British sent a giant armada, largest of its up to that time in history, to take Cartagena. And they had something like 30,000 troops, if you add up everybody, the sailors and everything, and the sutlers and all that. And Spain knew they couldn't, that we can't stand against this. I mean, their cannons were rusty. Gunpowder was damp. Their soldiers were underpaid. They let everything go. But this guy, Blas de Lezo, came, and he was the kind of Basque that, the great Catholic missionary, founder of the Jesuits was, just hard as nails. St. Ignatius Loyola, he was that kind of Basque. And if you recall, St. Ignatius Loyola, to cure himself from being shot through both thighs with a 45 caliber arquebus bullet, marched on his knees. He did the pilgrimage to, Compostela in Spain on his knees. Like those are the kind of Spaniards that, conquered the New World. And Blas de Lezo was one of the last of them. And so he devised this strategy. The British attacked Cartagena, and he said, I'm just going to hold every strong point as long as I can and retreat back to the other, let it go after I've exacted a price, go back to the next strong point, etc., all the way back to the city. And I'm going to hold out until the rainy season comes and the mosquitoes start doing their work. And his strategy worked. And it was, most of the British troops died from yellow fever. They were dropping, like flies.
Another really big personality who was against Blas de Lezo was Admiral Edward Vernon. Can you tell us a little bit about him? Because I think what fascinates me about him is people who have meteoric rises and then crash and burn. And that sort of seemed like what his career, at least in this war, was.
Well, so he's an interesting guy. He was absolutely correct in all his tactical judgments. He didn't want to, he said, if you're going to, he'd had experience in the Caribbean before. He said, if you're going to engage in war in this part of the world, it's got to be fast. He said, it's got to be resolved within 6 weeks of hitting the ground, because if not, everybody starts dying from yellow fever. And he knew, and malaria and the heat and rotten food. He knew this. Well, they wouldn't listen to him. So he was kind of a naval reserve at the beginning of this war. He had fought in earlier wars against Spain. There have been several. And he was in Parliament, and he got tired of the, policy of appeasement that Walpole's British government had towards Spain. So the British people were outraged at these ships being stopped and Jenkins' ear being cut off and other sailors being tortured. And Walpole was essentially a peaceable man. He was the first English prime minister, they say, the first great English prime minister. He was called First Minister. So he kept appeasing the Spanish. And Vernon stood up in Parliament and accused him of being a coward and all this stuff. And Portobello was one of the great Spanish transshipment points for the gold and the silver from the mines of Peru and all the other places, famously impregnable. Well, Vernon said, I can take this port with 6 ships, only 6 ships. And so there was such an outcry in England, they gave him 6 ships and they sent him to the Caribbean. And darn it, he took Portobello because it was, like other Spanish possessions, a hollow shell. Like half the cannons weren't working, the troops were drunk, this kind of thing. There wasn't enough gunpowder. He takes that port. News gets back to England, and there's a huge public outcry. He becomes a hero like you hadn't seen since Marlborough, right? And that's where these coins come in. So there was kind of a nascent souvenir market in those days. They had prints. You would go down to the print store and buy a print of the Battle of Portobello. They also had these little souvenir coins that you traded with your friends, and there was literally thousands of varieties of these coins, most of them showing Vernon. He was just so beloved. And they made so many of those coins that you can find them today on Etsy. Yeah, like along with beaded purses and, used Doc Martens. They're Admiral Vernon coins. But and their entire branches of, I always forget how to pronounce this word, numismatics.
Yeah.
Numismatics is the study of coinage devoted just to these coins, like their volumes. There's so many of them. So yeah, he became a huge hero. He took Portobello. The next target is Cartagena, and that was the disaster that was just bungled and bungled and bungled, not by him. Now he knew, if we're going to do this, we got to do it fast. We got to do it. Essentially, you don't want troops on the ground. Well, they paired him with the British command structure had a dual nature. Navy command, Army command, they were separate. There was no overall commander. So he could suggest to the Army guy, well, you need to do this quickly. And the Army guy would say, I don't feel like it. And that was it. So they got this terrible general named Wentworth, who had never had any battlefield experience. He had been a logistics guy back in England. He ran his campaign on the ground in Colombia by the book, as you would fight a war in Europe. Before you're going to assault a fort, you have to build entrenchments, batteries, which took weeks. By the time he had his batteries finished, everybody was dead of yellow fever. I mean, it was a disaster. And Vernon kept saying, for God's sakes, would you just attack? And because he knew, these are paper forts. So you had that on one side. On the other side, you had Blas de Lezo defending each paper fort to the absolute limit of his ability to do so. And it was just, so he loses that siege of Cartagena. He's essentially blamed, and his stock, plummeted.
Speaking of stock plummeting, I think one of the most fascinating stories out of the whole book was the story of the South Sea Company. You called it an unholy public-private partnership, and it's hard to even really understand exactly what this company was formed to do, except to be a scam.
Yeah.
Could you maybe just tell us a little bit about, because it's the bubble of bubble, like any bubble you talk about today, the stock market, the cryptos, any of that.
Yeah.
This is those boil down to their worst essential elements.
So, I mean, it is a complicated story with a lot of moving parts. And I'm always interested, as a historian, I guess I can call myself that. Although I also sell tickets at a movie theater, so I don't know what that means. But in any case, I'm always interested in why things happen. Where did it come from? And so backing up a bit, at the end of the War of Spanish Succession, the British received the Asiento contract. So they need a vehicle to administer this contract, So they create a company that is partly funded by the public through stocks, and it's partly government controlled. So it really opens the door to a lot of corruption. I mean, you've got high government officials that are, determined to make their private fortunes off this company. Now, the company was organized to trade the slaves, to the Spanish colonies. It was called the South Sea Company. And again, they quickly find that there was no money to be made doing this. So and now keep in mind, this is a company that is partly government, right? All the, the directors are government people. They decide to smuggle, that. So it's like the United States. It's like Colombia now, the government it's like a narco state, deciding to, to turn a blind eye to a profit-making venture that's illegal. So this is what happened. Now, the South Sea Company was issuing stocks. And saying, oh, there's just vast fortunes to be made here. You better get in on the ground floor. And so they started selling stocks. And it's also pushed by the government. The king is buying stocks in the South Sea Company. The value of the stocks go up and up and up. Their profits, even with the smuggling, it's hard to make the kind of money they were talking about with an illegal trade. Because an illegal trade is clandestine. and you can't have vast warehouses. Hey, there's an illegal warehouse, So the public is sort of talked into believing that this company, you buy a stock in this company and it's going to make a fortune. You're going to be a rich person. Now, the same thing is happening in France at this time. The Mississippi Bubble Company, which was started by the Mississippi Company. So it started by a famous scoundrel, economic scoundrel called John Law. So on the same principles, like he said, look, France has just acquired the Louisiana territory. We're going to make so much money off of this that, everybody's going to make a mint if they buy stocks. And so, of course, eventually, Louisiana did make some money, but it took hundreds of years, So these people are buying these stocks, and there was just they were literally paper stocks. There was nothing underneath them. And so this is the essence of a bubble. The value goes up and up and up. The public's confidence goes up and up and up. And all of a sudden, somebody says, this can't keep going up forever. The bubble bursts. Everybody loses all their money. And it was a disaster, both in the case of France and in the case of England. So, yeah.
Was part of the fallout of that, did that exacerbate problems between Spain and England?
It did, because the company, should have been just taken out of commission, but they were too highly connected in the government with the king, his mistresses, and all the rest, that they survived this disaster. And they said, look, we have got to make money here. And so they stepped up their smuggling effort. So their smuggling got, more and more egregious. And the Spanish guardacosta's, ransacking of English ships got more and more, So, yeah, it was one thing led to another there.
It's interesting that a lot, the main conflict points are the smugglers doing something illegal for the British, and then the Guarda Costa doing something illegal from the Spanish side. And this conflict that they're having just keeps ramping up and drags everybody in.
I mean, the interesting thing is on paper, it's all legal, because the British are pursuing their legal trade in slaves and their one yearly ship, the annual ship of trade goods. And the Spanish are just, policing their waters and making sure everything's, fair and square. Well, in fact, they're both cheating. I mean, they're both cheating on a grand scale. I mean, you can imagine these Guarda Costa ships, they were, the crews were essentially pirates. They were ruffians, scoured from the ports of the Caribbean. And once they got their hands on a British ship, it was not going to be a gentle, let me look into your cabin. No, they tied everybody up. They beat the crap out of them. In Jenkins' case, he actually was an honest merchantman. He did not have any smuggled. And so they, an infamous Guarda Costa captain, Don Juan de Fandino. So Don Juan de Fandino, strung him up 3 or 4 times, almost to the point where he was choking to death, then would drop him on the deck. They beat up the cabin boy, tied the cabin boy to his legs, hauled him up with a cabin boy, or tied around his feet, whatever. Finally, they cut off his ear. So that's the kind of treatment, the Guarda Costa was dishing out to the British.
Now, swinging back to North America, you had mentioned Gooch's regiment, and Georgia is a really specific, or a really specifically interesting case, because it was founded as sort of a buffer between the Spanish and Florida and the British. And it was a relatively new colony at that point, wasn't it?
Yeah, so I touched on this slightly earlier. So really, there's 2 arms to this war. So there's the arm with, regarding the smuggling in the Caribbean, the siege of Cartagena. Then once the Spanish win at Cartagena, they start getting bold, and they're like, we can take back Georgia, which was called Guale when they ruled it. We can take it back. Now, the colony was new. It had been founded in 1733 by a guy I call the redoubtable Oglethorpe. Now, Georgians will know of this. If it's Oglethorpe, James Edward Oglethorpe was really a fascinating guy. He lived to be almost 100 years old. So he was born in the era of Louis XIV, whom he met, and died in the era of Thomas Jefferson, Adams, whom he met. So he really spans this really transitional, point in history. So he was a high-minded guy. He was a philanthropist. He founded Georgia as a haven for quote-unquote worthy debtors. At that time in debtor's prison, you went to, if you had a debt you couldn't pay, you went to debtor's prison where you couldn't pay it even more. So, they actually, they the concept boggles the mind, but they charged you rent in debtor's prison. Like you had to pay food, housing, and according to how much you could pay is whether you had a decent place to live, or the people who couldn't pay were thrown into these pits, literally, where they died of diseases. And one of Oglethorpe's good friends, who was a very cultured guy, a classical architect and, a thinker and all that, he borrowed money to publish a book called Villas of the Ancients Illustrated. It was in Latin. He thinks this is going to be a bestseller. And it was a disaster. He lost all this money. He got thrown in debtor's prison. He dies. And Oglethorpe gets interested in the cause of debtors because he said this man was not a criminal. He was trying to, write this book to instruct English architects on how to design beautiful buildings, and he dies as a criminal. So he founds a colony, along with some others, to accept worthy debtors, like people like his friend, a new start in the new world. And as it turns out, very few debtors ended up there, but others did, like, Protestant sects, extreme, like the Salzburgerians. They're sort of an evangelical sect. People interested in starting a new life, prostitutes from London, this kind of thing. Moll Flanders, Defoe's novel is about Moll Flanders goes to Georgia. So Oglethorpe founds this colony, no slavery. Now he needs to be celebrated. It's the only one of the colonies. He outlawed slavery. He says there's no slavery in Georgia. There's no rum, which is an outrage. But in any case, no Catholics, which would leave the rum and the Catholics part leaves me out. I couldn't have gone. And this part I like. No lawyers. He had a lot of trouble with lawyers in his life. So no slaves, no lawyers, no Catholics, no rum. Other than that, anyone could come who wants a new start. It's the first Jewish settlement in the Americas, the Savannah. The Jews came from Spanish-speaking Jews came to from the Caribbean via Brazil and all that. So one of the early synagogues in America was founded in Savannah. So it was a very liberal, in the classical sense, place. Now, the South Carolinians hated him because they had slavery and rum and lawyers. And so he is there founding this colony in Georgia. The Spanish decide, we're going to take back Georgia. The time is ripe. We've just beat the British. We didn't think we could do it. So they land what for the time was quite a large army, about 5,000 to 6,000 troops at St. Simon's Island in Georgia, which is now a beach community, I believe. And Oglethorpe had about 900 guys. And that includes, he had his own personal regiment given to him by the Walpole, the prime minister, about 600 guys. He had a couple hundred Yamacraw Indians. The Indians, he loved the Indians. He learned their language. He was like what all Englishmen dealing with Indians should have been. So he was a very honest, honorable guy. And he had a regiment of Highlanders from Scotland wearing their kilts. And these guys were great fighters, the Highlanders. And so with 900 guys, he defeats the Spanish army sent to take back Georgia. And it was this little battle called the Battle of Bloody Marsh. There's a marker down there at St. Simon's. And ultimately, only a few hundred people were involved in that battle. It was like an advance party of Spanish regulars and a few hundred of Oglethorpe's troops with some Indians and some Scots. And all in all, maybe 400 participants, 500, something like that. Well, that battle decided the fate of the eastern seaboard, of the colonies, essentially. So the British won that. Spaniards said, oh my God, we can't defeat these Brits. And they turned tail and went home. So
then the Oglethorpe, he kind of tries to go and he takes on the Spanish in their territory in Florida after that.
Well, so he had, and got to backtrack, again, a lot of moving parts. He had invaded Florida before the siege of Cartagena and himself been repulsed. So the genius of the Spanish military philosophy in the New World was they used the climate. So they built they were geniuses at building fortifications, massive forts in their heyday, when they had the money and the men. And the British would throw themselves at these forts and the Spanish would hold out, and eventually disease and heat would start, working its magic on the British attackers. So this happened to Oglethorpe in 1740. He retreats. He was ill. They speculate he had malaria or something, and he was ill for about a year. He was ill during the campaign, so he didn't have his usual vigor, He gets back to Savannah, which he founded. It takes him about a year to recover, and by that point, the Spanish have beat the Brits at Cartagena and are preparing to invade Georgia. So South Carolina is the mother colony, essentially, of Georgia. He goes to South Carolina and says, please, give me some more troops. And they're like, nah, we don't, just leave us alone. We're drinking our rum here, And so he was alone in the defense of Georgia. So it was quite an achievement for him.
And now, a brief word from our sponsors. It seems like in all of these theaters of the war, it's a back and a forth. It costs tons of troops, tons of money, and then they wind up pretty much back to where they started. Yeah. Well, I mean, so in the end, what happened what did the war do? The War of Jenkins here. Now it bled into a European conflict called the War of Austrian Secession. So which lasted till 1748, but fought on the continent. So like a lot of historians, to me, the component involving the Asiento contract, the South Sea Company, the war in Georgia, that's the War of Jenkins here in this hemisphere involving the colony. So if you're just talking about the War of Jenkins here, well, the British lost their biggest gambit to take Cartagena and to start rolling up the Spanish colonies in South America. And there's a famous Spanish historian that said had the British taken Cartagena, that would have been the end of Spanish dominion in South America. Imagine if South America had been like the United States, English-speaking colonies. That was poised to happen. So they failed in that master gambit. Now, the Spanish failed to take back Georgia. So it's almost like, the scales are balanced a little bit. But the British learned, because there were a lot of recriminations from this war, the disaster of all the men dying and the ships lost and all this stuff. The British realized that the next war we fight has got to be handled differently. We've got to have a unified command structure. We can't have the Navy and the Army fighting each other, essentially, which is what happened. So they learned how to fight wars in the New Worlds, and they learned how to fight wars in general. And from that point on, you have an unbroken string, except for the American Revolution, of British victories up through the 19th century. It's funny, though, too. Do you think that they maybe learned the wrong lesson about how to integrate the American colonials into their system and their army by treating that regiment, Gooch's regiment, that was supposed to be a full British regiment, and they treat them so poorly, and they never really integrate the Americans again, colonials, into their system very well.
Yeah, I mean, the Americans, didn't really take to the British system of discipline. I mean, even up until World War II, I mean, you have, American soldiers questioning their officers. Captain, do you really think we should? There are machine guns up there. You know what I mean? The British soldier would never do that. That's just, we were much more democratic even then because of our experience on our own in a wilderness, fighting guerrilla wars against, Indians who know the terrain. So that's a whole different kind of warfare. The British never really learned how to deal with us, but they did learn how to deal better with other colonial forces like Indian regiments in World War I and, African regiment. They just treat them as you would give them the arms they need, the uniforms, the food, etc. They always looked down on them slightly, but treated them far better. So they did learn how to treat their own sort of colonial troops later, but not Americans. They never really could deal with us.
I think a way to wrap things up is I'm always interested. It's easy, or it's probably relatively easy to find what the British thought about this and to dig into those sources. How was it finding the Spanish side? Because I think you represented the Spanish side very well. It was a really balanced way to look at the war, that it wasn't just all rah-rah British. How was it finding Spanish sources and getting a Spanish perspective?
Well, I don't speak Spanish. I speak French. There are Spanish sources in translation that I managed to find. Like there's the journals of the leader of the Georgia. Well, it's a report that he wrote. Montiano was the governor of Spanish Florida, and he's the one who led the invasion of Georgia. And he wrote this long report exonerating himself, and that I have a copy of that. So you get his view.
You mentioned that they had in Spain, they built or erected a statue to, was it to Blas de Lezo?
Yeah, Blas de Lezo, yeah.
How do they view the war? Is it more of a important part of their view on history than maybe it's kind of happened into American history, especially since they had a couple of awful wars mixed in there, even more worse kings. Do they maybe put a little bit more stock into this war?
They remember it. I mean, they literally just raised the statue to Blas de Lezo in like 2014. And they remember Blas. So, in the way of history, particularly Spanish history, and you find a lot of ancient history this way. Like the guy who won all the battles is the guy. Like his enemies, like go to the king and say, this guy wants to take over. We need to. So Blas de Lezo was after successfully defending Cartagena and saving South America, from a vast British armada, is accused of willfully destroying Spanish property because he sank a bunch of ships in the channel to, you've destroyed an entire, flotilla. And so they're going to send him back to Spain in chains like Columbus, to answer these charges. Well, fortunately, he died of yellow fever before he got there. So he always was his reputation was under a cloud, for centuries. Except in Colombia, where they've had a statue of him for the last 100 or so years in front of the fort there. So finally, his reputation got rehabilitated in Spain. They now recognize him as a national hero, who defended Spain's honor and, empire against, overwhelming odds. And they just erected a statue to him. I mean, heck, it's only 7 years ago.
I mean, I think that's a part of the story is that maybe that's why it's so hard to conceptualize this war, because there's so many moving pieces.
Yeah.
Nobody, like our good guys, don't win. And then it's based on a bad premise, slavery and smuggling and financial bubbles.
It's crazy. And the reason why we don't hear about it, I feel, is that we lost. The English-speaking side lost. And so the British downplay it. They don't like to talk about it. It was a disaster. It's like us losing the D-Day invasion. I mean, that's how big it was at the time. Now, I guess I should conclude by saying the one monument we have is Mount Vernon, which George Washington's brother built. George inherited from his brother and was named after Admiral Vernon, who was, Lawrence's commanding officer. And Admiral Vernon was a good soldier. He knew what to do, what not to do. Just nobody listened to him.
Oh, wow. I didn't even make that connection. Mount Vernon was named after, so he really did respect him that much to name his home after him.
He did because, the American regiment, a lot of them were taken against their contracts onto the ships to fill gaps in the sailors who had died of yellow fever. And it was a lowly position to be a sailor. And they were soldiers. That was different. So Lawrence Washington was taken aboard Admiral Vernon's ship to act as a Marine. And there are the Marines say these were America's first Marines, right? The American Marines of Gooch's regiment who served on the... In any case, Admiral Vernon was a spick and span admiral. He scrubbed down his decks with vinegar like every month. He got all his ships had a much higher survival rate. And so Lawrence attributed his survival to Admiral Vernon. And so he named his house after Admiral Vernon.